Okay, just knowing that we are short here on time today and we want to cover a lot of great content, we're going to start our workshop. We want to welcome you to our workshop today. We are discussing a really interesting topic, sensory inclusion in the arts and cultural sector. What does it really mean? To introduce myself, I am Alexander Jones, he, him pronouns. I am a white male with yellow rimmed glasses, brown hair, brown mustache, and I'm using a background right now as my office, and it's blurred. I am a accessibility specialist here at Woodland Park Zoo. I've been at Woodland Park Zoo for about 2.5 years. I also serve as an advisory committee member on the Seattle Cultural Accessibility Consortium, and very excited to have everyone here joining us today, a real host of great panelists. So we're going to talk a little bit of some intro stuff, and then we'll get right to our panelists. Next slide, please. So again, this topic is sensory inclusion in the arts and cultural sector. What does it really mean? Presented by the Seattle Cultural Accessibility Consortium. And our mission is to connect arts and cultural organizations with the information and resources to improve accessibility for all abilities. And we'd like to say that SCAC is fiscally sponsored by Shun Pike. Thank you, Shun Pike, for your support. Next slide. We'd also like to acknowledge the lands that we live, work, and play on, and the unceded territory, traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and that we occupy this land. This acknowledgement does not take the place of authentic relationships with Indigenous communities, but serves as the first step in honoring the land that we're on. And we also have at the bottom of the slide here some resources if you'd like to learn more about the tribes that we are located near, and also about the Indigenous land that you're on. Next slide, please. We'd also like to set the stage here for today's event. We'd like to say that this is a safe place, and the fact that you are here is a huge deal. We respectfully request that everyone research and share resources proactively in an effort to broaden our collective knowledge. Refrain from judgment, speak your truth while knowing the truth of others may be different. Approach with curiosity. Recognize privilege in yourself and others. Accept that each person and organization operates at varying levels of accomplishment. Listen and pause to understand before responding. Take responsibility for your contributions. Acknowledge that today's conversation may reveal bravery and also spark discomfort. Gestures of kindness and offers of assistance are strongly encouraged. Next slide. We also want to thank our sponsors, Humanities of Washington, the Seattle Foundation, the Office of Arts and Culture, and Arts Washington. Next slide. The Seattle Cultural Accessibility Consortium also asks that you consider making a donation to support our mission and future workshops. Together, we can increase accessibility. Please donate at the link here provided on this slide. Next slide. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Luis Mendoza.
Thank you, Alexander. Welcome, everyone. My name is Luis Mendoza. I use he, him pronouns, and I am a mid-60s Mexican male. I have black hair, a gray beard, and I wear glasses. And today I'm coming to you from my office, which is blurred in my background. I'm also the recently retired director of the Washington State Fathers Network, which provides support and resources to men who have a child in their life with a disability. And I am also, like Alexander, a proud member of the Seattle Cultural Accessibility Consortium Advisory Committee. I believe that over the next hour, we'll have a very informative discussion on the subject of sensory inclusion in the arts and culture sector. And I believe that because we have 4 outstanding panelists joining us today. But before we get to panel member introductions and our discussion, I want to let everyone know that there's a lot to cover on this topic, so much so that we may not get through all of the questions that we have planned. But the good news is that on March 29th, from noon to 1 o'clock, the consortium will be having its first connection session of 2023, where attendees will have small group discussions on strategies for creating sensory inclusive experiences. So if you want to know more, ask questions, or share information on this topic, we look forward to having you join us on the 29th. Information about how to register for the consortium connection session will be put in the chat. I also want to mention that we've scheduled time at the end of today's session to answer questions. If you have questions, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll answer as many of them as we can. Any unanswered questions will potentially be used as discussion starters at the connection session. Now, let's jump into our discussion. Bios for each of our panelists were provided in the PowerPoint you were emailed, so you have those. So at this point, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to very briefly introduce themselves with just their name, the name of their organization, their preferred pronouns, and a visual description of themselves before answering our first question, which is to clarify some terms for our audience. We have heard terms like relaxed performances, sensory-friendly activities, and sensory inclusion. So please, after introducing yourself, if you would let us know what these terms mean to you and your organization. And Natasha, why don't we start with you?
Hi, everybody. My name is Natasha Ransom. My pronouns are she, her, and I work at the Museum of Pop Culture, also known as MoPop. I am a white and Latina woman in my 30s. My hair is brown, and I'm wearing glasses and a blue shirt. And I'm coming to you from my office, which has colorful calendars behind me. I think something that we've learned in our journey through equity and inclusion is that the terminology is constantly evolving and changing. So as soon as you get married to one definition of a word or phrase, things evolve. So really what we try to think about at MoPop is sensory inclusion just means how are we making our space a space that feels accessible and welcoming for everyone, specifically including the senses. And because that's constantly evolving, our work is really to allow humility in that understanding and allow for that understanding to change when we get new feedback and we learn to do better. So we're focused on, for example, for our sensory friendly events, we have lower light and volume sounds. We have fewer folks in the space. And we just give lots of time for folks to explore the museum in any way that works for them.
Thank you. Ms. Pucks, if you would join in, please.
Hi, my name is Mixed Pucks Plenty, and I am a Black non-binary femme. I'm wearing brown and black glasses, and I'm wearing red lipstick, and I have a red curly hair that is covered by a brown and black turban, and wearing brown and black shirt with a red dress. And I am, my pronouns are they, them, yes, queen. I'm a burlesque performer and producer based here in Seattle, Washington. I am the executive director of production and the founder and co-producer of What the Funk, an all people of color burlesque festival, and Fat Less Fest, a all plus size burlesque festival. And when talking about sensory inclusion in the arts and the definition of things, here at production, we are just looking for better ways to serve and entertain our audiences that may have issues with may have sensory needs or processing issues. And I say that as someone who has lots of sensory needs and processing issues. So.
Thank you. Actually, could I have all the panelists at least turn their cameras on You can stay mute if you're not speaking, but it would be great to see everyone at one time. Ross, can we have you chime in on your introduction and the answers to the questions?
Yes. So, hi, my name is Ross Edelstein. Use he, him pronouns. I am a white man in my mid-20s with dark brown hair, a lot less than I would like at this point in my life, and a thick brown beard with tinges of red in it. I'm wearing a charcoal gray suit with a purple shirt and a blue and purple tie, and my background is the disability pride flag. I am I am a PhD student at Indiana University in the special education program. Most of my work actually isn't schools. It's everything that's not schools pretty much. I have a master's in museum studies, and most of my work is in cultural institutions, particularly making them more welcoming for disabled people in general, and autistic folks in particular, in part because I am an autistic person. And I have what's it called? Words fail me. One of the great joys of the way my brain works is that I'll go on a train and then it just goes to a completely different track for no reason. But in particular, a lot of sensory friendly, sensory inclusion, so on and so forth. To me, it's not enough. Because one of the things that I found is that in a lot of cases, making an event or a single space or something like that doesn't necessarily help in the day-to-day, right? I've seen some really great programs that I go back the next day and how am I supposed to be involved? And so one of the things that I run into is, okay, we can make this great event. How can we make it so that somebody who wants to come in not during the event can do that, or somebody who's come to a couple of events and feels like they're ready to come the rest of the year can do that? So I see it all as a starting point.
Thanks, Ross. I'm having a hard time finding my mute button. Tiffany, can we have you chime in, please?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Tiffany Sparks-Keeney. My pronouns are she, her. I am an independent inclusive arts consultant. I'm a sensory-friendly theater specialist, and I'm an occupational therapist. I'm also a professor at the University of Puget Sound in the occupational therapy department. I'm wearing a sort of navy blue top that's V-neck. I have shoulder-length brown hair. I'm half Japanese and I'm in my mid-40s, and I've got a bluish background with my logo for Inclusive Arts OT down there. And I also have lived experience as a person with ADHD and with sensory processing disorder. So I bring that to the work, as well as having children who have differences in those areas. So to me, when we think about definitions and those sorts of things, when you talk about sensory friendly or sensory inclusive, one of the terms that I like to throw out is sensory sensitive, because I think we can't know that we are being friendly to everybody's sensory system. Everybody's sensory system is different. And I think that we need to acknowledge that. And so by saying sensory sensitive, it means that we're paying attention to the sensory environment. We are looking out for things that can be changed, and acknowledging that the best of our abilities are still going to fall and not meet the needs of some people, because it's constantly a growing and learning process. I also agree with Ross that, and I know we're going to get to this later, but there are labels that we put on certain performances. This is a sensory friendly performance. This is a sensory inclusive performance. And I like to look at things from a universal design perspective. So in our day-to-day existence, in our day-to-day events, how are we constantly incorporating processes of sensory sensitivity in the same way that we include braille guides or ramps or those sorts of things. So surfacing barriers to participation that aren't just physical disabilities, but looking at other types of barriers to participation.
Thank you. Thank you all. I want to ask a couple of follow-up questions. If I was an arts and culture organization and I was thinking about getting involved in offering sensory friendly or sensory inclusive performances or events, the labels that we've been talking about, sensory inclusion, relaxed performances, sensory friendly performances, do they all mean the same thing, or how would I know what to call my event? Ross?
The label doesn't really matter at the end of the day. They all are fairly interchangeable. So again, I do research on this. I forgot to mention I work at the Epley Institute for Parks and Public Lands, which is a center of the Indiana Institute on Disability and Community and currently contains the National Center on Accessibility. These are a lot of big fancy words, but the short reason I say this is I did the first study on autistic experiences in outdoor spaces, because for some reason nobody's ever had the idea to just ask people what they've experienced. And one of the things that within that and within the work I found is a lot of this stuff really started in like 2011. So this is relatively new. Like that you can really see the start of all of these things happening around that point in time. The other part is that you have a lot of this work is done sort of as places realize the need, as somebody in the organization, and it's also one of the reasons that a lot of these things start and then might not continue. One person is interested in doing it, and it doesn't necessarily get traction with the rest of the organization. And so there's a lot of different words that are used for this. Sensory friendly, relaxed performances, sensory friendly performance, so on and so forth might be the most common terms. But as long as you're getting across to your audience that, hey, we're trying to make this particular experience something that's more welcoming for someone with a particular sensory need, that is sort of the reason that this language exists, right? Half of these programs are advertising. Like, you can have the best program ever, but if nobody knows what it is, who's supposed to be who you're designing it for, and especially when you're talking about a lot of these programs, a lot of them are aimed at kids. I regret to inform everyone who might have these programs going that are all child focused at non-children's museums. I did not stop being autistic at 18 or 21, depending on jurisdiction. I am still autistic to this day. The reality is that a lot of these programs, when you don't have a good description of them as well, and don't tell people what it is, and don't tell people that it's happening.
Yeah.
There was the first
Ross, I'm just gonna interrupt you for just
ahead.
a second there, because I think we might get to some of that a little bit later if we get far enough into our questions. So
cool. I will
thank you.
thank you for cutting me off. Just for the audience, I did ask for them to do this. So
Tiffany, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I think when it comes to terminology, right now, the thing to acknowledge is that in this work, there is no codified term and there is no codified meaning of what it means when we call an event sensory friendly, sensory inclusive, sensory sensitive. And I think that is a barrier to participation in that it puts some of the onus on the people attending the performance or attending the museum or what to find out, what does sensory friendly, sensory inclusive mean to this organization? How do they present it? And so anybody can label something as sensory friendly or sensory sensitive. And I think it is incredible that so many organizations are learning to offer these kinds of programs. At the same time, it is, I think, somewhat of a barrier in that my version of what I consider to be sensory sensitive versus Ross's versus Natasha's versus mixed pucks are all different. And so, you know, in my perfect world, eventually we would form an organization and we would talk about these terms and things so that people, when they attend an event, have some base understanding of this is what it means in general. But we're just not there yet.
Okay, thank you. One last follow-up question. Since we're talking about definitions and big picture, when I talk to people, I hear people talking about neurodivergence. They generally think about people who are on the autism spectrum. So when you're looking at doing or organizing a sensory-friendly, sensory-inclusive performance, what audience are you thinking about? Just so that the folks that are attending this workshop have a broader spectrum of who they might be able to include when they're trying to provide services for the neurodivergent community. And anyone can chime in.
I think you're right. We do need to expand our definition beyond those with autism. And frankly, anybody can have sensory sensitivities. You don't need to have a diagnosis to know that when somebody clicks their pen behind you over and over, it drives you mad. Or when you walk through something and there's a certain sense, it raises your limbic system. So all of us, every person out there has some sort of sensory difference or sensory challenge. So I like to look at just it in general. But I think in addition to autism, we consider ADHD, we consider sensory processing disorder, auditory processing disorder. And then I think one of the things that's important, as Ross said, is considering people don't outgrow these diagnoses. And in addition to, you know, the more typical neurodiverse diagnoses, I think we need to consider mental health, things like post-traumatic stress disorder, things like anxiety. All of those sorts of things bring heightened sensitivities to the work.
Great, thank you. Anyone else have a comment on that before we move on?
Yeah, I was just going to add on to what Tiffany said. I was going to mention PTSD if she didn't, but yeah, basically any visible or invisible things that make processing the world at large more difficult for us, anxiety, depression, sensory overload. We're really just working on a lot of these sensory practices are just best practices in general. A lot of the accommodations that we're making for our sensory friendly programs are accommodations we should be working towards to be making for our museum at large at MoPOP during regular hours, all day, every day. So a lot of these things, you know, as Ross pointed out, we silo to a specific event and then our space isn't actually inclusive for folks all of the time. So I think really taking it away from like, this is for this type of specific audience who has this one need, and instead looking at it from a more holistic approach of how can we make our space sensory friendly for everybody at all times. And knowing also how people have mentioned, it's not going to fit the needs of everybody always, but in general, how can we just be more inclusive with our regular hours and not for specific events?
Thank you. Actually, Natasha, I think you started talking about my next question when you did your introduction, but I'm curious now to move on to talking about what kind of strategies are used by arts and culture organizations to make neurodivergent audiences feel welcome. And more specifically, during or even before the event, what kind of changes are made? What kind of supports are offered?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, the thing that we have done is include the voices of the folks we're serving in the planning. So we're not guessing what these needs might be. We're not saying like, oh, we heard or did research on this. We're actually including folks from the community that we're serving in the planning of the events. And then we're getting feedback after each event. So for me, those are the two most essential components of these programs. And then, so for example, for our sensory friendly program at MoPOP, we've lowered light we've lowered volume, and the specific adjustments we've made have been informed by folks who are saying, this is how much I think you should lower the volume, this is how much I think you should lower the lights. Before the event, we provide a social story for all audiences that includes what to expect, where they'll go, what that will look like, how long the event is, any information that will help them prepare. And we also include a sensory map of the museum, which includes low, medium, and high sensory levels throughout the space so that they can opt in or out of higher sensory spaces. And then, like I said, after the event, we try to follow up, we try to get feedback, and then we take that feedback every single event and integrate it into how we produce the event next time.
Yeah, I'm hoping that we have time to get to how that kind of feedback is acquired. So let's hold on to that thought for a minute. Tiffany, I believe you have some slides that you want to show that to kind of tie into what Natasha's talking about.
I do. And I don't know who has the ability to pull up those slides.
I think they're coming now. Here we go.
So this is just an example of some of the work I do. So prior to, we talked about what a social story is. And for those of you who aren't familiar, a social story basically just explains, when you enter a space, this is what you're going to experience. And it has pictures describing things and words describing things. So this is part of a social story that I wrote for Seattle Opera. So the first page talks about, I'm going to see an opera. Next slide, please. This talks about what a person experiences when they come in the door, what they will see. And again, something like this helps to reduce anxiety because it allows things to be known and understand what is available to them. Next slide, please. I try to include things like that anybody might need to visit, like the restroom. Here are things that you might notice in the restroom. For the performances I do at Seattle Children's Theater, next slide, please. I preview each performance, and then I write up an audience guide that's available for people prior to the performance. And because the house lights are at half during the performance, people can follow along with this. So the first thing I write up are environmental considerations. So things about the environment that are just general to the performance. Next slide. And then show content considerations. So what are particular things to a show that might be surprising for people? So for example, Don't Let the Pigeon Drive the Bus. The show is similar to the book, but the show may be different in many ways from the book. So kids and audience members aren't expecting things to be exactly the same. And then next slide, please. I go through a scene by scene description, and I look for moments of visual intensity, auditory intensity, and then emotional cues. So suspense, emotional intensity, and audience interaction. And so for each scene, I try to pick out heightened sensory elements and then make a description of those elements. And this is all what's available to the audience prior to coming. And then I also work with the production team on their elements. Next slide, please. One of the things we do to set up the environment to make it more open is we have special areas. So for instance, the front of the theater is just an open area. The green seats that you'll see in the back of this slide are a technology area. So generally in theater, people aren't allowed to have cell phones or tablets, but we welcome that in those areas. The blue areas you see on the side are movement areas. So everybody is welcome to wiggle around in their seats as much as they need, stand up as much as they need, but that's an invitation and an open space to let people freely walk about and those sorts of things. So thank you for those slides. So those are just examples of some of the things that are available to audience members ahead of a performance.
I've heard of, and I've seen something called Know Before You Go FAQ sheets. Can you talk about those if you know what they are? Ross?
Yeah, so all of these sort of fall into a category of pre-visit materials. which are a huge part of how you make someone feel like they can come, especially someone who has any sort of, and I want to make clear, a lot of these things don't just help neurodivergent people or autistic people, even if they're designed for that group, and I'll get into some of this, a lot of them help a lot of other people. Now, a know before you go or FAQ tends to be more, these are questions we have been asked, these are things that we think are going to be concerns, or we think, you know, are big points. While the reality is with a social narrative, I put this in the host and panelist chat, social stories are actually a trademark term. People have been sued over using it. Social narrative is the sort of non-copyrighted term. Those tend to be developed with experts, be it people who live it, or special educators, or occupational therapists, or anyone can make them, but they tend to be developed with these sort of specific ideas of, we're going to call out from the beginning to the end what the experience is like. Whereas if FAQ is, here is a piece of information, here's a piece of information, it might not be in that sort of, what is your experience of participating in the event or the experience like. The other thing about social narratives in particular I want to bring up is they're not necessarily great for adults. They tend to be very much storybooks, and that's great if you need that. If I'm presented as, this is how you get that whole experience of this organization from the beginning to the end, and it's a storybook, that's kind of insulting, right? That's saying, hey, you're like a child. And the reality is that and this is something I've actually been working on developing, but developing that same sort of thing, but in plain language for adults with links to other areas, and including things like, how do you get there? What are, where are the bus stops? Where are the train stops? Where, so on and so forth. Things that don't just focus on your organization itself, because people still have to get there. They still have to plan ahead of time. Talking about those types of things and making sure that an adult can come whenever and have this information, that helps a lot of folks.
Thank you, Ross. Appreciate that. Ms. Pucks, is there anything that you would like to add from the perspective of the format you work in, the burlesque environment?
So the burlesque environment is very loud and very colorful, and there's glitter everywhere. It is a sensory nightmare. Burlesque is literally a sensory nightmare. And for someone that has sensory issues, who doesn't like having a lot of makeup on my face, every time I'm putting all the makeup on my face, I'm like, here we go again. This is really gross. So it's been kind of a long road in terms of how do we create any type of experience in burlesque that has that is meeting some of these sensory processing things. And a lot of that is actually, during the pandemic, we were kind of forced to make a lot of virtual content. And that is where we really saw an ability for us to really shine in the burlesque community by creating burlesque shows that people can pause and walk away from and come back to, and so that's been really helpful. So I still record a lot of my shows and package them in ways for people to purchase later on, and so they can enjoy it in the comfort of their own home. But we're still working on how do we provide a relaxed viewing environment when burlesque in and of itself is like very, very loud and very, very colorful and very, very, it's a lot. And so we've been working with burlesque is filled with a high percentage of neurodivergent folks and folks suffering PTSD who are also the main drivers of our financial income. We joke that we've been sharing the same $1,000 for the past 20 years. So really working with the performers who are actually the attendees of our shows to figure out what is going to be, how are we developing these policies and best practices for us has been a game changer in creating spaces for performers to have like quiet space before they get ready. So I think about my customers first, on my performers. In burlesque, we don't get paid a whole lot. It's kind of wild. And then we take that feedback and we use that to create best practices for our audience, which may not be the way that everyone else does that, but it's because burlesque has a really high percentage of performers as audience members. I would say that our audience tends to be 75% performers, depending on where you're at, which again, kind of goes to show you that we're out here supporting our own.
Yeah, interesting. And I'm seeing head shaking as you're talking, and I'm just want to encourage the other panelists, if somebody says something and it causes you to ask a question of yourself or want to ask that person, how does that work? Or, how would I make that work in my environment? Please do that. It would be great to have that conversation and hear it happen live. I know that we have a break coming up. I want to ask one more follow-up question while we're on this subject. Other than sensory inclusive events, are there ways that neurodivergent patrons can be accommodated at arts and culture events? Oh, Ross, go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've had my hand in developing in a few places, here in Indianapolis, the Idle George Museum has, as far as I'm aware, the first built from the ground up. We tore down walls, rewired spaces, things like that, quiet sensory room in the United States. In any museum, at least, there might be other organizations that have it differently, and this is also as far as I'm aware. I helped design it when I was an intern. They gave me the museum credit card. I looked at it and like, what is this? I don't even have my master's yet. Why am I getting the organization's credit card? Who would allow this? I'm 3 kids in a trench coat. But the reality is that space is open all day, every day. It's always there. It has and it's also a lot of quiet rooms, sensory rooms, so on and so forth, tend to be converted closets. And there are a number I've seen where it's literally just a closet. They put a chair in there. Congratulations. This is where, if you need a break, you have to go find this closet and lock the door in the closet. Which not really super helpful if that confined space is the issue, or if, they only have lights on, lights off. Sometimes I just need less light as opposed to no light at all. Also, if it's just a chair and not a particularly comfortable one, how am I going to get comfortable to be able to deal with sensory needs? And let me explain real quick how that works. Imagine the brain kind of like a bathtub. Yes, I'm going somewhere with this, I promise. But as you experience the world, the bathtub fills up, quote unquote. Every experience you get, every stimuli, whether it's new information, light, sound, so on, fills it up. In somebody who is not neurodivergent or doesn't have issues with processing the world around them, the drain generally works pretty well, unless you're putting a fire hose on this bathtub. If you are autistic, if you're neurodivergent, if you have issues with sensory processing the world, that is like one of those stupid Starbucks straws, and it doesn't really work to drain anything. So the reality is and when it overflows, that's when a meltdown happens, and we don't want that to happen because it ruins the experience for the person who's just trying to have a good time at your museum, at your festival, at your theater, so on and so forth. providing these spaces is basically a way to get away from that, but also a place where you can stim effectively. And there are a lot of types of stims, but one of the big things is that if you have just this tiny area and you have to move around, or you have to do what I've heard, and I refer to it myself as shrimping, where you go and get into a weird position in a chair or on your bed or whatever that doesn't look comfortable to anyone else, and it makes you look like a shrimp. But because of the particular expressions of neurodivergence that someone has, in particular, in my own cases, I look very much like a shrimp. It's super comforting for you. And if there's nothing in there, that ends up being, well, what is really the point of this? Is it to make it so that nobody else has to deal with what I'm experiencing? Or is it to actually try and provide support? So making these sort of intentional quiet spaces is a huge help.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you for that perspective. At this point, we're going to take a 2-minute break, and we'll come. All right. There have been a couple of questions asked in the Q&A. The most recent one is getting to the next question that I want to ask, and that is, sensory-friendly events are often held on special dates or at special times. For example, once a month in the morning, or for one show out of a run of shows, which has led to some controversy about whether these events promote inclusion or segregation. What comments do you have about that issue?
From my perspective, there are two things going on. I think offering a particular sensory-friendly performance can feel very supportive to some people, knowing that however they show up, this performance is created and welcoming for them. At the same time, I think we need to have a larger conversation in performance, in museums and all of those, about what we consider to be acceptable behaviors and not acceptable behaviors, that increasing the opportunity for people to show up as they are and be welcomed into the space, regardless of whether it is a traditional performance or a sensory-friendly performance, is a conversation that needs to happen. And to do that, I mean, that's a major cultural shift that needs to happen. And I also think that's where universal design comes in. So for example, having audience guides available, not just for the sensory-friendly performance, but for all performances, creating a movement section for all performances, not just sensory-friendly performances, using visual cues in the theater or something for all performances. So I think it's not an either or, it's a yes and. It is a yes, we have a performance. And I think it's also important to note that for the sensory-friendly performances that I've been involved in, it's not just people with a diagnosis who come to those shows, that it is inclusive in the sense that we have audience members who are there because they know it's a sensory-friendly performance, and audience members who just happen to be there and it's a sensory-friendly performance. And to me, that is the essence of inclusion and not exclusion. Exclusion says, this is just for you people over here. Inclusion says, this is for everybody. And in particular, we want to acknowledge and welcome people who might not feel comfortable going to a traditional performance, or whose needs might not be completely best served in a traditional performance.
Thank you. I have questions or follow-ups I want to ask Tiffany about, but do any of the rest of you have any comments on this controversy of inclusion versus segregation?
I do, and I can tell you a lot of it is, again, goes back to what I was talking about. It can't just be for kids, but also one of the big things to talk about is that there are some people who really need those particular experiences, however you're putting it together, right? There's some people who really want to participate in again, going back to the Idle-Jorg examples, they have every year as their sort of holiday exhibit, a model train exhibit called Jingle Rails. It's great. It's also the only time the Idle-Jorg is a museum that focuses on Native American and Western art, which is in a lot of cases quite a dichotomy, but they have Jingle Rails is a model railroad exhibit that is all made of natural materials, showing various places in the West, so cities, national parks, things like that. It has done it, and one of the big things with that particular experience is it's busier than any other time of the year, because otherwise that museum is pretty much a traditional art museum. And it's also when there are the most kids in the museum at any point. That isn't a field trip. And so the reality is that is, if you're going by what typically sensory inclusion means to a lot of folks, which is not super loud and busy and things like that, the average every day is pretty fine at the Idle-Jorg. The thing is that with that exhibit, there are some people who are going to need that particular sensory friendly experience. And one of the things I've done with that is try to turn it from, okay, we've just turned off some of the sounds and turned down the lights and kept fewer people here. I've tried to push them into offering other activities that have other sensory components. So good example, this past year, I helped them develop a holography activity, which is basically you take a bunch of things, and in this case it was the various natural materials that the exhibit was made of, tape them to a piece of paper, dip it in some ink, and then put it on a different piece of paper, and you've sort of created a print with a unique texture and unique sense, but also you've created your art itself. The actual plate, quote unquote, is a piece of sensory art itself, and has its own texture and feeling. And so the reality is providing experiences during these things that you might not otherwise get. It might not be as useful for, say, theater or something of that nature, but where you can provide these extra experiences so that you can say, okay, this is a sensory friendly experience. We know that it's not going, that there are some things that we're taking away, but we're going to try to add something that you can opt into. You can choose if you want to do this. And hopefully it'll be something that makes you remember that we're actually trying to give you an experience that welcomes you, but then also provides an opening. There are a lot of folks who need a few sensory friendly experiences before they can go to the sort of average everyday experience. And that's why making sure that you're not just focusing on that as the form of inclusion, but really looking at the organizational structure, the way, the rules, the way that you've developed things, having things on hand every day, having good staff training, and ideally staff training should really focus on people at the top, because those are the ones making the rules.
Ross, I think we're going to actually, the next question, if we can get there, is regarding staff training. So let's hold on to that for just a second, but thank you for that information. It had been put in the chat that our time for Q&A is coming up. So if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A now. I see a few in there at this point. When Ross was talking, it reminded me that in my work with the Fathers Network, working with fathers who have children with disabilities, working with those fathers and those families, I would often hear from parents that one of the hopes that they have for their children is that their children would be able to experience the community the same way that everyone else does. And they would like that to be as inclusive as an experience as possible. And personally, that's why I'm interested in this whole arts and culture inclusive experience, and why I'm on the consortium advisory committee to try to make those kind of things happen. So it's this whole idea of inclusiveness is really important to families, but there are families who do, as Ross mentioned, realize that some of their family members, or as individuals with a disability, that they may not thrive within a particular environment. And so having those times that are set aside for just them to be at an event is helpful. So I hear both sides of things, but before we move on, Natasha, Ms. Pucks, anything you'd like to add on this subject?
I mean, like, I feel really stuck in this conversation, mostly because, again, burlesque is just, it's so freaking loud. And it's just, like I said, it's a lot. And I say that as someone who has ADHD, and it's a lot. I mean, I've been able to thrive in this environment, I think, because of my ADHD, and I produce so much. It's wild what I'm turning out and putting out. But one of the things that we started a burlesque school last year. So our school's been going for 3 years, and we're on our 3rd cohort this year. And one of the things that we do really early on is we ask everyone what their access needs are, regardless of where they're at. And I am a big fan of, I like meeting people where they're at, not where I want them to be or where I wish them to be. And so this has been really helpful. We've had several students who are autistic, who have ADHD, who have sensory processing disorder, that have found the way that we are structuring this program for them to learn the art of burlesque. So you learn the history of burlesque, you create a character, and you get to put you get to create an act and put it on stage. And so we're helping them every step of the way. And so there's group activities, there's solo activities, there's sending the homework ahead of time. For the whole session, they have the homework available to them for the whole session, so they can take their time and do it at their leisure. We're really I'm really loosey-goosey with when things are due and time structure, mostly because that's how I move and groove through the world. There's a time in my head where things should be done, and then there's 3 or 4 days on either side of it. The other thing that we've done that, that inclusion, I come at this also as like a person of color, as a Black person, and this idea of like safe space and like inclusive spaces kind of always makes my skin itch, because I'm like, only the most marginalized person in the room can decide whether or not this is a safe space for them. But I think we've created a brunch show that has kind of just naturally kind of become our sensory friendly show, because it's earlier in the day, and we have bossa nova music, which tends to be a little bit lighter on the sound, and people tend to do kind of more of these classic, more flowy acts instead of lots of jarring movements. And so it's just kind of naturally become this thing, and it's been really, really beautiful. But segregation, inclusive, I think that some things are for everybody to enjoy, absolutely. When we start looking at how baked into our society ableism is, it really does prevent a lot of people from having honest conversations with themselves about what their needs are. So again, this idea of creating things, letting folks know that everyone has access needs. They may just not realize that or ever been asked that question before, I think goes a long way in terms of what when we're looking at, is this segregation versus inclusion? I think that's the big question to ask ourselves and kind of put forth too, is what are folks' access needs, and how can we meet people where they're at, not where we want them to be?
Thank you very much. Natasha, before we move into some questions and answers, anything you have to add on the subject?
I mean, I think I'm just hearing a lot of requests for universal design. So a lot of like, don't silo, don't do this one thing for this one tiny group in this one way, like mostly just how can we integrate a lot of these best practices for all of our audiences at all times. And again, like I think I've already said this a couple of times, but just including the voice of the audience that you're serving. So making sure that we've been running our sensory friendly programs for years, and we're still getting feedback on ways to change and improve the program. So we're never done learning how to adapt and evolve for our audience. We're never like, this is the way the program is and it doesn't change. You know, each time we do it, we're trying to make it more successful, more supportive, better.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to start transitioning into the Q&A a little bit early. We have one question that I think we've begun to answer, but I want to see if anyone has anything else they would like to add based on this question. So I'll read the question. It says, I struggle with being inclusive without being exclusive. We hold many concerts, which I'm trying to shift from children to all ages. I can't obviously disinvite the young families, but I am trying to provide a safer space for those who need unstimulated services. Any thoughts on how to approach being inclusive without being exclusive that hasn't already been said?
I think
I'll just, oh, sorry, go ahead, Tiffany.
No,
Go ahead,
go
Tiffany.
ahead.
Tiffany,
Okay,
go.
I have
Tiffany,
one
go ahead.
quick, I
Go
have one
ahead,
quick thing
Natasha.
to say, which is just that when we market our sensory friendly programs, we say these programs are open to anyone who benefits from these accommodations. So we're not saying, hey, you can only come to this if you prove you have this disability at the door. We're saying if you decide that this is beneficial for you, you can be there. And I think folks, I think Tiffany said earlier, like everybody has some kind of sensory need. So thinking about it less as like, how do I keep these people away in order to meet the needs of this group? Trust that folks will opt in if you use the right language and how you communicate about the program.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think a lot of it is marketing. How do we get this information out to people that, hey, whatever your age, whatever your diagnosis or undiagnosis, whatever you bring to these experiences, hey, this is here. And part of it is just getting the message out that these things are here for audience members or for museum participants or for dance class. I do work with an inclusive dance class, so for dance class. So it's just figuring out how to get the word out to whomever you're targeting. And marketing is not my strength, so I don't know. I mean, I tend to post a lot of things on Facebook, on the various Facebook groups I'm a part of, or bulletin boards, but it's just getting the word out.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go back to the first question that came in. It says, so often sensory-friendly work makes already existing work, often created for non-disabled audiences, accessible by adjusting environments, rules, etc. Where does disability aesthetics, that is, creating work that centers disability, show up in this space?
I want to build off something that Puck said about this, which is, I think, is getting people with disabilities involved in the creation of the work, and recognizing that it's not, in the community for people with disabilities, we often say nothing about us without us. And so are you including the voices of people with disabilities in the creation of the work? In cases of stage, do you have neurodiverse actors on stage? Do you have people with physical disabilities? How are we presenting that? And I think the more people we get in theater in terms of directors, choreographers, performers, stage techs who have disability, then the work transitions from being, we're creating this, and then we're going to have a separate thing for people with disabilities, to we're centering this work for a very inclusive experience.
Any other comments?
I'm just going to
Go ahead, Ross.
Very close to my microphone, because this is an important point that I want everyone in this room, if you come away with nothing else, talk to us and pay us. We disabled people, particularly when you're looking at neurodivergent people, and because, again, I tend to focus on this in my research, autistic people are the least employed group in this country. And money Unfortunately, we live in a capitalist society. Unfortunately, I have bills to pay. Pay us. Don't just come in and it's one thing to say, yes, we're doing a feedback survey, but don't go to members of your community, invite them in and say, hey, we're looking for you to give us this sort of consultation, this work, in a lot of cases emotional labor. The way that I do my work when I do consulting is I go into a space, and not only do I have all the research trademark and all the stuff that I've done there and this sort of field expertise, I just go in and I be autistic in the space, and I have ADHD in the space, and I have depression, and I have anxiety, and probably dyscalculia, but the diagnosis barriers are a huge thing. And in fact, on that one, that is one of the big reasons that if you try to say you have limit supports to people who have particular diagnoses and quote unquote proof, doesn't really work, because I have all the tools to say, I know I have this, I just need the piece of paper, but the psychiatrist ghosted me. It was also $2,000 to get the diagnosis. My girlfriend is autistic. She can't get a diagnosis because when her parents brought her as a kid to get that diagnosis, it was, she's a girl and she makes eye contact, she can't be autistic. And when I told her, I'm 90% sure you're autistic as an adult, and when she went to her doctor, it was, you would have been diagnosed by now. So remembering that, centering, again, having co-creation is a huge part of it. Paying people, not just limiting things to people with the particular fancy piece of paper, whether it's as a consultant. Now, this doesn't mean you shouldn't hire me because I need money. But and jokes aside, but limiting things to just who has the right qualifications and pieces of paper, because the reality is I can come in and I can, as a consultant, say things, and I can help develop community bonds. And I can tell you that it has been successful by saying, hey, we're actually doing this. We went to somebody that does this and also lives it. And now we're asking for you to help make it even better for the people who actually live here. And that is a huge way to make things, to do this co-creation. And also remember that, especially, in a lot of cases of various, what's it called? Shows, trying to choose ones that have actors who actually have that disability. If you have an autistic character in a show, try to get one that has an autistic actor who's actually playing them. That is a huge issue with a lot of shows, and that's a whole other conversation for another day on media representations of disability, but you don't have to have, trying to also make sure that the shows are doing justice to the actual disability and not just Flanderizing it or making it, stereotype.
Yeah, that's a whole bigger topic about how to make arts and culture activities and events inclusive to everyone, and not just patrons, but to artists as well as employees and board members. There's a whole broad spectrum of people that need to be included. And each of you, I think, during this last hour has mentioned how important it is to include those that you're trying to serve, either on committees or as consultants, or just to talk with them or get feedback in some manner. It is really such an important point that you're all making, that we're talking to the people that we're trying to serve and including them in conversations and decision making. I think we have time for one last question. This one says, have you ever seen well-intentioned attempts at sensory inclusion that have missed the mark? What might we be inclined to try that we should avoid? Ross, I see your hands up.
Yes, I put this answer in the chat, but certifications do not work. Most of the organizations that will offer you a certification do not actually involve the voices of, in particular, if they're saying a particular group, do not involve that group and do not involve the voices of disabled people. And also, you can't really certify organizational culture, right? It's constantly changing. And the reality is, when you look at disability, most of the things that I face as issues are not, yes, I can make my room a perfect sensory friendly space, but if a bird lands on my radiator and starts chirping and I'm already a little overstimulated, that could make me even more overstimulated, right? But that is not the same as we have chosen to, for no good reason, make a spoken interactive that fills up this whole space, or we have allowed this done nothing about how sound travels in our space, or we have random lights that just go everywhere. So trying to go for a certification, it's a good it sounds good in theory, but when you do it, the reality is it's only going to be a moment in time. And also, a lot of certifications focus only on people who are your guest interacting staff, not necessarily the people who are making decisions. And especially with how jobs are these days, who are probably going to be there longer than the person who, frankly, no cultural organization is able to pay as much as I'm sure any of them would like to, just because of, again, we live in capitalism.
Ross, I'm gonna cut you off. That's okay, just because we're down to about a last minute, and I just want to see if any of our other panelists. I see Tiffany's hand up, so Tiffany, go ahead, and this will be our last answer.
I wanted to say, it's kind of like Puck said, only the most marginalized person can decide if it's a safe space. And I mean, we are going to miss the mark. That's why I talked about sensory sensitive versus being sensory friendly. I think the way you try to avoid that is by not trying to reinvent the wheel on yourself. It's like Ross said, there are people out here who have a lot of experience in this area, and who have lived experience of being, a person with ADHD or a person with anxiety like I am. And so hiring people to support you and partner with you in this work. And at the same time, anybody can hang out a shingle and say that they do this work. So really looking at a person's background, a person's lived experience, talking to other organizations and saying, hey, what has your experience been like working with this person, is probably the best way to avoid the first stumbling steps. But recognizing that we are fallible. We are all doing the best we can for inclusion. We're bringing our own lenses, and we're gonna make mistakes. And that's why it's important to continue to get feedback, to continue to center voices, to continue asking questions, to not be an expert, but a partner in this work, both with the people whom you are working for, who are creating these experiences, and with audience members and with people on stage.
Thank you. That's a great perspective for us to end on. And we are going to end this part of the workshop with the panel. As we transition to this last portion of our time together, I found this to be fascinating. I found it to be very informative. As you can tell, there's lots to talk about. There are questions we didn't get to about how staff is trained, how feedback is given to organizations on how the event was received. How does the disability community find out about these events being offered? There's lots and lots of topics to talk about. And so I'm hoping that you'll be interested and will join me at the Connections event on March 29th. Again, how to register for that is in the chat. You can also go to the consortium website and register there. But at this point, I would like to thank our panelists for being with us and sharing their expertise. I know you have so much to say, and we couldn't allow you to say it all in this short amount of time, but thank you very much. And now I'd like to turn things over to Pamela, who is a long-term loyal contributor and donor to the consortium, who will close us out. Thank you.
Hi, folks. My name is Pamela Miatov. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Director of Audience Services at On the Boards, which is a live performance venue in Seattle. I'm a white woman with short, straight, dark brown hair, and I'm wearing a textured white sweater with a big gray floral scarf wrapped around my neck. I'm wearing a headset, and my background is my office with a blur filter. I've been coming to the Seattle Cultural Accessibility Consortium workshop since 2019, and I found them to be extremely helpful to my organization, from logistical things like making sure the alt text on our images is getting better and more consistent, to shifting the larger conversation around programming to start being more aware of systemic ableism, and to constantly asking who's being invited and who's being excluded by our programming. Today's workshop was super helpful in sparking questions around how to implement accessible programming around sensory friendliness. And I'll be bringing lessons back to my organization. I'm here to ask you to donate to SCAC. They need sustained funding from our community to continue doing this important work for us. You'll find the link in the chat, and it's also in the PowerPoint materials. These workshops are free to attend, but if you do have the means and ability, please do consider donating when you're registering. Even if it's just a few dollars, every little bit is really helpful. I also strongly believe that arts organizations ought to dedicate funds for professional development for employees to attend workshops like these to raise the bar for implementing accessibility in our organizations and in our community. Not just talking about accessibility, but actually putting money in the budget to support learning, growth, and development in our community. This is something I'm currently advocating for in my own organization, so talk to your leaders and your board. And donate today. There's a consult, as was said before, we have a Consortium Connections networking event on March 29th, so please register on the SCAC website. It's an opportunity to get to know folks in the arts sector and to find out what strategies other people are using within their organizations, and develop our shared knowledge around the realm of sensory inclusion. So thank you so much for attending today, and hope to see you for the Consortium Connections event. Thank you so much.